Today, I'm delighted to be joined by two fabulous colleagues and friends who are really well known within the travel community and particularly within sustainable travel. The first, Sally Higgs, probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Sally spent more than 20 years across the travel industry, across many different roles on all sides of the supplier and buyer world. She is a leader and on the board of many GBTA committees, including the Sustainability Committee, and has been with FESTIVE Road now for a number of years, leading many of their travel and sustainable travel initiatives. I'm also delighted to be joined by Amélie. Amélie is a member of the sustainability consulting business within Advito. Advito is one of the leaders and has been in the sustainable travel world for many years, offering one of the ISO certified methodologies for calculation, providing emissions consulting and reduction services across all of their clients, and then finally offering employee engagement and solutions to inform and educate employees and travelers on the keys to emissions reduction. And really excited to have you. As we start today, there'll be a couple of topics we end up focusing on. One, we'll start by setting the stage around sustainability and why now is different than it's been over the last few years. We'll talk a little about an approach to policy and how this time requires a different thought and methodology and strategies for how we think about what our policies mean and how do we deploy our typical strategies as travel buyers to drive emissions reduction. And then finally, we'll start thinking about how do we start looking to the future? How do we engage and enable the business and executives to look forward and drive emission reduction strategies? And then how do we translate that to engage our travelers so we have a holistic program that leads to results? And we'll end with Q&A. So with that, we'll kick off. We are at a really interesting time now. Sally often says we're sort of at this T-60 moment where we've been talking about 2030 for a number of years. But if we think about the beginning of 2025, we're now 60 months away from that journey. 60 months in the typical enterprise, travel buyer program is just around the corner. And so it means we have to make a pivot and really focus that transition from measuring our emissions, which has been the emphasis and the topic of conversation for a long time, to actually reducing. And behind that is a different set of catalysts. We like to talk about it through the lens of we're moving from sustainability and emissions reduction being a moral imperative only to being both a moral and a business imperative. Regulation, as we've been talking about with CSRD and many other initiatives around the world, has really come to fruition starting in 2024 and is only growing as we are now all going to be asked to set expectations. But maybe more importantly, the second catalyst that we see that's driving things towards really being a business imperative is customer and client demand. For the first time over the last 6 to 9 months, we're really seeing the biggest customers and clients demanding that their suppliers show progress towards emissions reduction and actually quantifying what would be the impact on the relationship if we're not making progress. And that's forced lots of organizations, not just travel teams, not just sustainability teams, but the finance office, the executive teams, to really be able to say, here is the risk of doing nothing. And here's how we're going to start articulating our strategy and quantifying the business value of hitting emissions reduction. And that's forced every organization to take emissions reduction and the strategy behind it in a different direction with much more intensity and urgency. Here at Clarasight, we're here to support that entire journey. We are the carbon planning solution for the business travel industry, where we help organizations really think about how do we apply the traditional financial and business planning tools that help model and forecast the future to travel and to the emissions reduction world. And we're lucky to have partnered with many of the leading organizations who have really focused on emissions reduction as a business imperative in that journey. And as we get started now, there's really going to be 4 areas we talk about. One, How do we think about ensuring sustainability as a driver of business value? 2, how do we think about modeling and forecasting the scenarios necessary to actually meet both the emissions needs, but also the business needs and business growth? Then how do we think about providing business leaders with the data and tools to be successful? Because we alone as travel buyers can't implement and drive emissions reduction by ourselves. And then finally, how do we implement behavior change? How do we think about the carrots and sticks and other tools we have at our disposal to move forward? And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sally.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming along. So I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes about the different kind of levers and mechanisms that you guys can put into place today or plan to put into place in 2025. And the way we've split this out is that there is a carrot and stick type motivation. And there isn't a one size fits all. And you've probably heard this before, but is anything you implement is as unique as your travel policy and your company's organization. So you could see your direct competitor or peer put something in place, don't necessarily think that's going to work at your organization. I think the first thing to do when you are looking at any kind of strategy is just take stock of the culture, what motivates employees and especially travelers within your business, just so you've got a starting block of where to go. Can you click to the next slide, please? So what is most effective? I'm going to talk about I'm going to split them really into your carrot and stick, and arguably that all can be really effective, but it's all down to you on picking which one is going to be what's going to work for you. It's like you don't want to get a carbon budget and you see that a carbon budget has been really, really great at your peer organization, but in your organization, it's like a square peg in a circle hole. So listed on there, lots of things about what motivates people. And again, it's down to industry and your company, competitions and competitiveness might be a big driver. Visible goals, if they're there, if they're really part of your culture, you're living and breathing those goals and specifically sustainability goals and other parts of the business, not just travel. That can be an easy thing to tap into. Financial incentives work, but they're not, unfortunately, not available everywhere. Reputation is a key thing there, and Phil alluded to before that clients are asking for emissions reductions and sustainability, and that feeds directly into that reputation. And then consequences. There may be some businesses that like a real stick and consequences work really well. I'm going to talk a little bit about doing things targeted. So pilots are always a good thing to do. But you could look at focusing on divisions, looking at the divisions that travel the most. If you've got a couple of divisions that account for 65, 70% of travel, focus on them as opposed to the whole business where they're only doing 1 or 2 trips a year, which maybe not a good use of time. And also a region. It might be easier to roll out in a specific region because you have more buy-in there, or they could be the region that does most of your travel. And then company culture. We're going to talk about a couple of actionable tips that you can put in place, but it's really important to understand if you have mandated policies versus non-mandated, and then top-down targets and no set targets. But I'm going to run through a few ideas that can apply, that anybody can put in place over the next 6 to 12 months. So first slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about your sticks, and the backbone to a stick is your travel policy. So if you can get travel policies across the line that actually mandate certain behaviours, then that you may find that the stick approach works really well. So what that looks like in reality is air to rail mandate. You cannot travel by air where there's a high-speed rail option, let's say less than 4 hours or 3 hours there. And you can do that by just blocking the flight in your OBT, depending on your TMC and tech stack, or, you know, it could be something that's done behind the scenes. You can also put a carrot in front for the air to rail. It's a great thing to put a premium cabin in there if you're traveling over 2 hours by train. It's not going to eradicate huge amounts of emissions, but it's best practice. And I think it's something that every travel policy has there. So don't look at it and say, oh, it's only going to reduce this many emissions. It's something we just should really be doing. Taking it to the next step, approvals. Now, approvals are nothing new. We've had pre-trip approval for decades. And it was used before as a cost reduction mechanism. And when I talk about pre-trip approvals, that means that even before you can even, you know, book a trip or look at a trip, an approval goes to your manager and they have to say yes or no. And this technology is available everywhere. And we can repurpose, recycle, being very sustainable. We can make this a carbon initiative. You can set these by emissions, really go in, like anything over a ton of carbon needs approval, or anything over 6 hours, or any flight. You know, it's down to how you want to configure it and what your TMC and online booking tool can support you with. There are some negatives to this. Lots of last minute travel. If you can't get in touch with a manager, that means they can't book. They could go out of policy. They could go, you know, book direct. And there is a risk if you have a non-mandated policy, you could drive people to book direct, which is going to play havoc with your duty of care and actually your carbon emissions calculations when everything is sitting in your expense tool. So approvals can drive some really good reductions in carbon, but it's not for everyone. And it's down to your policy. Do you have that mandated policy? Do you have consequences for people who book outside of the travel programs and approved channels? The next one is looking at cabin class. You could increase your business class from 6 hours to 8 hours, or 8 hours to 10 hours, or even take away, if you're really brave, take it away altogether. And it has happened. It can be really effective because not only does it reduce the emissions by up to 50% or more, it actually stifles demand. You may see people they're thinking, oh, I don't really need to go to Cape Town now. I can do it virtually, because the thought of sitting in economy for 10 hours actually makes them not want to travel. So again, it can drive some really, really good emission reductions. Again, you need to have a really mandated policy, because people will just go off and book direct and expense back. You've also got to get buy-in. Finance are probably going to be on your side, sustainability as well, but there may be a HR and wellness issue there. Maybe having some flexibility around people traveling long haul. If they're flying overnight, do they really need to be in work first thing in the morning after a long haul economy flight? It's not the best. So maybe some flexibility for some free time after. So yeah, that's another option. Any travel policy changes require top-down and executive alignment. And to do that, you need to have some real clear objectives and measurements of what you want to achieve with them. And so moving on to the next one, talking about the carrot, because travel policy updates might not be for everyone, or they could take 6, 9, 12 months to get across the line. So, you know, you could put something in place, but you can also do things in the background on carrots. And it's about motivating, it's putting incentives in place to get people to own their carbon emissions, but also, you know, start playing ball, start, you know, thinking about sustainability. So with the carrot, visible goals are really good. You can have messaging on your online booking tool. You don't need a policy there. You can put any messaging up there and nudges. I would create some carbon KPIs out of reporting, such as CO2 per traveller, or CO2 per trip, CO2 per team, CO2 per project. Those are, again, how you work. So how this works in practice with your sales team. So your sales teams will all have a percentage win rate. They will have, the dollars of what they've won that year, adding some carbon. What is their carbon for the year based on, 25% win rate and $10 million worth of sales? And that equated to, I don't know, 4 tons carbon. You can add that in there. So once that's in there, you can start getting people to compete. And we know sales teams are very competitive. They're also the face of the company. And again, feeding back to what Phil said, it's the clients that are asking for these reductions. So if they can see their sales teams are actually really challenging and saying, can we do this virtual? I've got trying to reduce my emissions. Like, what message does that send to this prospect client? In some industries, that could send a really positive message over to those guys. Another top tip, sustainability people will actually like the carbon KPI. So if you have a bigger team that traveling, put them in place, because when you're talking CO2, you're talking their language. So you can get pilot with those guys as well, looking at those like competition, getting them to, reduce their emissions. You might have a sustainability team that wouldn't dare tread foot on a plane, so that's not going to work for you. But the compensation linked to goals, again, that could be something that once you put those KPIs into the sales team, that happens organically. You're not probably going to have the authority to say your bonus is contingent on this, but it could happen. I actually think in the next 60 months, 5 years, a lot of us are going to have carbon related goals related to compensation. I think that's going to increase quite a bit. Finally, Amelie's going to talk a lot about engagement, so I'm not going to go too far into that. But a few things that we come up with: getting sustainability into onboarding packs straight away, getting people as they step in the door. And it's a good first impression on sustainability, especially if we get the new generations in. They're so much more clued up than, well, I know I was when I started working in corporate land. And we're all focused on missions. Don't forget beyond carbon. CSRD is going to be measured lots of other data points, which will include things like biodiversity, but also supply chain, welfare of your suppliers. There's going to be lots of other data points. So have a think about what you can do there. Hotels, meetings and events. There's so much you can do on that side of sustainability. I would always tie them back to your organization's top level goals, because the talking points are already there. You get support from the sustainability team, and you're more likely to get exec support as well if you tie it all back to what's being worked on centrally. Over to you, Amélie.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. I just wanted to ricochet a little bit on what you just said. I think, all the sticks and carrots that you mentioned here are very interesting, because actually, with the clients that we work with, we actually notice, clients doing a little bit of all of those things depending on where they're at in their sustainability and travel journey. So the only thing I'd like to add here is that, as you said, right, each program is truly unique. And I think the travel policy sometimes can be rigid, or you might not have the time to go through all the processes to make it different and change it. But there are a lot of things that exist and levers within a travel policy that can be applied. So for instance, if you just have a line talking about rail travel, but no specificity, just saying you can expense rail, there is actually a lot of opportunities there to start implementing little things within your program and communicating with your travelers on when they could, leverage rail. Or for instance, if premium economy is allowed to certain travelers, you might not be able to push it to all travelers because of the travel policy that you have. But in terms of carrots, you can tell some travelers, well, instead of business, when it's a day trip, or like you travel during the day, you could shift to premium economy and communicating to travelers on why that matters and why their impact is so important. I'll talk a little bit more about all the communication tools that exist and how you can engage your employee a little bit later. But I think this is really setting us up quite nicely for that discussion.
You're welcome.
Terrific, thank you. I'll talk a little bit now about building off of a number of the points that Sally mentioned, which is really aligning it to the key objectives of the company because the talking points are there. I think the key here as you transition to this world in which it is an imperative from a business perspective to achieve mission reduction goals, and therefore you need metrics and KPIs and accountability tied to it. It's harder and harder to deploy sort of a draconian uniform policy, as Sally mentioned, and you get more carrots, more sticks, more influence, and more empowering people with the tools to figure out how to get there. And that becomes much more aligned to how an organization historically has done planning and management of goals across the business, right? Whether it's financial planning, setting high-level goals, and then pushing those ownership out to the business to get there. Or from revenue and sales planning, same thing, high-level goals, and then you empower teams with tools. And so the question is, how do you do that? How do you build credible and actionable plans? Because too often we've talked about these 2030 or other types of goals, but haven't had a strategy of how to get there. No one can talk about the how, we just say we need to get there. And what we see is that there's really three things that are necessary, none of which are unique to travel or unique to sustainability. They're actually the tried and true capabilities that finance, strategy, operations teams have always used to manage their business. And one, it's really think about how do I unify the right data and insights. And as you're thinking about planning and reduction, that's different data and different data sets than historically used for reporting. Sally mentioned around, well, let's think about what our sales goals are, and then what are our emissions against those sales goals so we can understand the intensity of our sales pipeline. These are some really good examples about how bringing that context, looking at what our sales goals are, our pipelines, and our conversion, we can start understanding the effectiveness and the efficiency of our strategies. Those are the types of data points where we're bringing sustainability into the business and marrying it with the traditional business metrics to start thinking about it. It's really important. So as you're looking to bring this in as a travel buyer, as a sustainability leader, really think about what is the right data and what are the right systems and what are the right tools I need to start beginning to roll out. And it's not simply on an annual basis doing that, right? It has to have frequency to inform decision-making. And what are the things that are going to help me make a better decision tomorrow based on the decisions today? The second thing is you have to understand where you're going. And I think this is where we see the most common challenges from organizations at the starting point, which is we often know where we are today. We know where we've come from coming out of COVID, and we see the trend, and we know where we need to be in 2030. But what we don't do is don't map out, given the business expectations, how we're going to grow, how travel has changed, how travel is coming back to levels that are similar to pre-COVID. What's the delta between where I need to be in the future, say 2030, and what would be my business as usual emissions output if we continue to change and do nothing? And that delta is an incredibly important piece to understand as you begin to set the context and develop a strategy, which is say, if we do nothing, we will be 5x what we are today because our revenue is expected to grow, our headcount is expected to grow, our projects are going to grow, we're going to be adding people in these regions. Those are all things that have to be put into consideration as you think about both the carrots and the sticks you're looking to prioritize. And then from that, once you understand the delta, once you have the context, you can actually start to develop the plan. What are the policies we are going to implement? What are the carrots we're going to offer? Which parts of the business, what are the levers that actually can move the needle? Because as Sally mentioned, each piece of this, it takes effort, it takes work, it takes buy-in. You need to be very thoughtful about what are the levers you need to pull in order to move the needle. And too often we see people trying to throw a lot of things at the table versus piloting with small groups, testing how much that's going to work, and then deploying it out, and then stacking these smaller wins up together that over time can really change the trajectory. The last thing I'll talk about here as we think about engaging the business is around making emissions reduction tangible. And Sally referred to this earlier, but I like to think about all of us in the sustainability world, whether we come from a travel lens or we come from a sustainability lens, we're really translators, right? The job of every large organization is to set very clear, simple goals that everyone follows, and to then really try to make it easy for our team members to execute against those goals. Too often we think about adding many different KPIs or metrics to the business, but if we're trying to engage executives as sustainability is becoming a business imperative, there are tremendous numbers of opportunities to translate emissions reduction goals into the language and metrics that teams care about. So we often talk about now that customers are demanding us to take action. You can then quantify the risk of not taking action. And so more and more of our customers in their customer contracts have required commitments. Now you can tie the commitment on reduction to a revenue number, to a cost number, and then translate it to the business stakeholders who are responsible for it. So now it's not, hey, we need to reduce emissions by X. It's, we have a 10 million, 50 million. We have a customer that has $150 million risk by 2026 if they don't hit emissions reduction goals. That is a translation mechanism that a CFO, a COO, your business leaders care about. When we think about new sales and the new expectations, sales leaders want to know what percentage of my top targets have requirements for emissions reduction. Now I can start understanding the total addressable market at risk. These are the types of things that allow us to translate sustainability into something that's much more impactful for all stakeholders and leaders to incorporate into their strategy. The second piece is to show ROI. I think oftentimes we talk about it, we think sustainability and emissions reduction is just an additional cost driver, whether that's because we have to think about going from air to rail and rail is going to be more expensive, or whether we're talking about SAF as the primary or only mechanism for reduction. But actually, emissions reduction, sustainable travel strategies can really show positive ROI, not only in cost savings through efficiency, but actually through productivity and traveler experience and risk mitigation, and actually being able to bring those pieces as you begin to tell your story and drive buy-in is really critical. Because whether it's the HR team thinking about the traveler experience and making sure we're being thoughtful about the value of travel and the purpose of travel and making sure we're using it in the right way to drive outcomes, and whether it's, if those of us who experienced the IT outage over the last few weeks and the hours in the airport and the waits and the delays, all of that is a loss on productivity. And we actually have organizations that we work with where the sales leaders are very focused on how much time are their teams saving by not traveling and how much pipeline is that creating for them net new because they're hitting the phones. That's the type of ROI, that's the type of productivity that organizations can really adopt and incorporate into their overall strategy. And then finally, what I'd add is you have to empower leaders with the data. And this is what Sally said, which is we have to bring it up and surface it. And it has to be frequent. It has to be real time. It has to be allowing organizations to use the information so that they can make better decisions tomorrow. Companies don't make decisions to drive emission reduction on a semi-annual basis or on a quarterly basis. They incorporate it into their strategies. They incorporate it into their plans. And they really need to have it so they can bring it into their monthly or weekly team meetings so they can do things better. And with that, I'll turn it over to Amélie to talk a little bit more about engaging on the employee side.
Thank you, Phil. Yes, so this section is going to focus mostly on engaging employees, so at all levels within your organization, and also specifically talking about your travelers and really enabling them with the information, the tools, but also with the emotion so that they make better decisions on behalf of your company. And I'll start with a pretty bold statement to get us started with this session, basically explaining that employee engagement has to really be part of your overall strategy, because if you are not doing this, you are leaving money on the table. So when you look at this slide, you'll see three different areas, and that really goes in line with what Sally and Phil just described. So the first point is regarding integrating data. So that is the foundation of any strategy, right? You need your data to be able to understand your footprint, your emissions, and bring that up with your leadership. And that, of course, require financial investment very often to get the right tools, the right dashboards, and so on. Then once you have a grasp on your data and you're clear on what your footprint is, the next logical step is to have a strategy. So that can be translated by a rewrite of the travel policy, for instance. But in any case, a strategy requires also investment as well as people, right? So you need to have people there to help you get that strategy off the ground. Now, what's often missing is that third piece, is that engagement, the engagement of travelers, but not only travelers, also stakeholders within your organization. Employees, all employees need to be educated on what sustainability is, on what the sustainability goals are. And that way they also feel included in the process. And, you know, there are more and more employees today that really want to make an impact, a positive one. And by engaging them, you're effectively closing that loop and making those people enact your strategy, which then you will see in your data is reducing your emission. So it's very key that your employees are a full part of your strategy. So it's very critical that it's paired with engagement. Data is paired with engagement. And you can stay on this slide, Phil, for this second point that I will make is the fact that very often when we talk about engagement, we think about the travelers. But I will actually advocate for engagement to start at the very top. And that also goes in line with what Phil was mentioning, that your leadership needs to be involved. They need to understand the sustainability goals. They need to understand the sustainability figures. And so your role in this matter is really to translating those numbers into more tangible figures and providing that education so that they can really grasp, right, what you're trying to do. And they can also be an advocate to your travel program as well as your sustainability goals. So it's really, really key that engagement starts at the top. What we do on our side, for instance, to give you some ideas on how you can engage with your leadership is to create, for instance, focus groups, really focus on sustainability and travel, where you go to your leadership and you present them with the data that you have, your findings, the level of actions that you feel would be good to use and put in place. And through those focus groups, you can actually capture questions and understand where there might be gaps in the understanding, because, you know, it might be very clear to you, but it might not be as crystal clear to your leadership. And so that's why those focus groups are very important to help, you know, your leadership understand and also be advocates of your travel program. And once you do that, what it will bring you is an actual internal buy-in. And so that is extremely crucial to help you develop appropriate change management strategies. So that's what we refer to when we talk about employee engagement, really providing that right education and those carrots that Sally mentioned. So that's the second point, really starting at the top. And then once you have that buy-in, you can actually start by influencing your travelers and also enabling them to support both your sustainability goals, but also your travel policy. So really bringing them into the fold. In terms of influencing travelers and employees alike, there are many, many ways to do this. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but really the ultimate goal for you through this process is to inform. So there is a big portion of that is really providing information in tangible ways for travelers. So maybe it's providing them with equivalency to CO2, because if you tell them this flight represents 1 ton of CO2, they might not really understand what that means. But if you tell them that with this amount of CO2, they could be driving X number of kilometers or miles, or they could be spending hours and hours in video conferencing calls, that helps them also influence their choice and also help them understand the true impact of their choice. In terms of influencing travelers, something that's also quite important is being able to differentiate your messaging, using the right colors, the right tone of voice, also very linked with your culture at your company, right? The company culture needs to be also part of that. There are some companies that are more focused on cost, and there are some companies that are more focused on wellness, for instance. So the tone of voice really needs to be aligned with what the organization is trying to achieve. And that's why it's so important, again, to have that leadership buy-in. The other thing is really empowering the travelers with clear, actionable information at the right time. And that's where I'm going to go into the different types of engagement that exist. So you can actually go to the next slide, Phil. Thank you. So the most common one that you're probably, or most of you are aware of, is that you can do a lot of communication through the online booking tool. There are many ways to do this. Here on this slide, you can see an example of a banner that basically asks travelers to fly responsibly, and providing them with a nudge to choose a specific carrier over another because they have a better aircraft on a specific route. So that is one way of doing it. You can also use nudges, providing education through the booking path, either at the beginning of the booking path, potentially even asking travelers if they've checked with their manager whether this trip is necessary, whether it supports the company's goal. So again, tying this with what Sally was mentioning earlier on approvals, maybe there is not an official approval process in place, but you could nudge travelers during the booking process and ask them to actually check in with their manager before they make a booking. So the online booking tool is a very powerful tool where you can provide information. You can also provide travelers with the CO2 figures and the equivalences. There are ways with partners, you can also look at gamification options. So there's really a lot of option with the online booking tool. And then there are also other tools that exist because obviously all your travelers and all your employees are different, and they get their information in different places. So there are also ways to communicate outside of the online booking tool. So you can think about your intranet, your traveler applications, like maybe you use a mobile app, or maybe you have email campaigns as part of your travel departments. So this is also something that you can leverage. There are many ways to really bring the travelers into the fold. Infographics as well. We have many clients that do little Earth Day campaign where they really use that time of the year to provide a lot of education on their sustainability goals and what they're trying to achieve. So again, it varies, right, on your company culture, on your goals, but there are many ways to do this. And then something that's also important when you influence travelers and you create a lot of those materials is the ability to report on the success of the messaging campaign. For instance, the click-through rate. You can maybe place trackable links, but it's important to also be able to understand the impact. And so that ties again back into that data. So we are closing that loop, right? We have the data, the strategies, employee engagement, and then once we have that in place, we go back to bringing it back to the data. So again, engagement is very key, and it depends on your company culture, which engagement you decide to choose, but start at the top and then bring your employees and your traveler into the fold and help them make the right decision when they're booking. And once a traveler start making the right decision, they're going to talk to the other travelers and they can be an example to lead with.
Amazing. So we're going to transition now into some Q&A. So I'd ask everyone, please add any questions you might have. We've got a few. I'd like to start with one for this group, which is, I think we've talked a bunch about different carrots and sticks and opportunities. the question I'd ask each of you would be, if there's one thing that you could implement or recommend that everyone implement in 2025 to position them for this T-60 type of moment to really move in direction, what would be the top thing that you would encourage an organization to do?
I've got a slight spin on it, so sorry, I'm not going to answer that directly. But my recommendation is that everybody on this call and meeting and anybody watching after actually puts their own carbon budget in place just for them. It's for them to actually start walking the walk, walking the talk, however you want to see it. So either base that on your 2019 and apply some reductions. Again, use it on your organization, or maybe last year. But I would include your personal travel in that. So I've had one for the last 2 years. If I do have to fly transatlantic for work, that limits where I go on holiday. Now, you don't have to go that draconian, but I've really put a lot of thought into it. And actually, it makes me realize that when I'm talking to customers about policies, like how easy or hard it could be. So I invite everybody to do their own. You don't have to share it with anybody, but it kind of like gets you thinking about, do I really need to go on that fam trip to Mexico? Maybe not. It's good, but is it worth 2.5 tons of carbon? And I know that sounds like I'm being a bit of a fun sponge, but yeah, it's almost like if you can lead by example and then understand the nuances of it, I recommend that everybody gives it a go.
Thank you. Amélie?
Well, it's hard to come back after that. But to answer your question, and Sally, I think what you're doing is a great example, and I agree that leading by example is definitely the way to go. But to answer your question, Phil, on the one thing to change next year or to improve or think about for next year, I would recommend that travel managers and sustainability manager really look at their travel policy. And even if there is no opportunity to necessarily change it, there are still ways to look at the travel policy, maybe talk to your peers, understand what they're doing, because there are effectively a lot of leeway and room within travel policy to make little changes and start talking to your travelers and educating them. So I think this education and bringing the goal to light for the whole employee base is very, very important. And I think travel is a good example, because a lot of employees travel, and so they feel directly impacted by that. So that's what my recommendation would be.
Gotcha. I'll add one thought, and then we've got a great list of questions, which is I'd really encourage everyone to start thinking about the travel emissions reduction journey and the ROI of that, and more like a traditional business plan, which is I build a forecast and build a plan. Where are we going and what is it going to cost, so that everyone sees it? And we're in a world where, right, the cost of travel is going to increase 10 to 20% per year over the next few years as planned. We're seeing growth. And so being able to really understand that's going to be important. And I'd really tie it to this idea of purpose. MXGBT and GBTA and others have done a lot of great research, T. Clara and others, around what is the purpose of travel and what's the value of travel, and beginning to think about what is the role of travel going to be in our organization going forward, and then forecasting and planning what is the cost and emissions associated with that really helps get every stakeholder on the journey of engagement, and getting alignment from a leadership perspective on what is the role of travel, what is that going to mean to us, and how does that impact our goals, is a really important foundational piece that I think every organization should implement for 2025 and beyond. I'm going to go through a couple of questions and ask people. So the first question we have, Sally, I'll feed this to you, which is, do you believe it makes sense to have train travel mandatory between specific city pairs, e.g. Rome and Milan, or instead of mandating it, should it be encouraged somehow, like a carrots or competition?
Good question, and sorry to be a stuck record, but it's down to your program. If you've got a non-mandated program and you suddenly start mandating, which could mean it's grayed out, you cannot book that flight, if it's not mandated in the sense that you go through your travel provider, you're just going to steer people to book directly on the airline website and expense back. So you then lose duty of care, and you also lose those emissions, because it's really hard to get emissions from expense data. If you have a very tight program, then yeah, I would put it in. It's best practice, and you're not asking people to travel like 12, 14, 24 hours overnight. Like, make it, if you are going to mandate it, keep it within 3 to 4 hours maximum. Carrots. I guess the way that you would approach that, if you have a non-mandatory program, I'd look at your personas and look who's traveling, like what divisions or what groups of your business are taking those short hops and domestic hops, and see if you can work with those leaders on putting some lead tables together. Anybody can do that. It's a pivot table. It's really simple to do, really easy to do with, doesn't matter what emission factors you are using. It's a simple one to put that carrot in place, which and get some competition going.
Gotcha. And maybe I'll ask the next one to Emily. Of all the carrots and sticks which you've seen across the client base, which initiatives have you found are the most effective and measurable in the short term?
This is a good and not easy question to answer. So there are, what I would say that I've seen that have worked a lot is actually what Sally was just talking about, this air to rail shift. I've seen a lot of success with this in terms of shifting travelers to rail, mostly on routes that are very short. And very often it also comes to the fact that travelers are not necessarily aware that there is a train that's running, or maybe the train is not in the online booking tool. So when that comes up, like, that's a bigger discussion to be had, right, on how to make sure that you can still capture that spend and those emissions as part of your travel program. But I would say the air to rail shift is something that I've seen work quite well, and it's been quite effective. Sally, if you have another idea in the meantime, I'll think about some others as well. I mean, our clients have, work in a lot of different areas. So
If
do
you're
you have
looking
any other
measurable short
Mhm.
term, yeah, and it's not ideal, but again, it's taking an old cost reduction method and applying it in 2024 is a travel ban. And most people go, "Ugh," and they're not pleasant, but they're effective.
Yeah.
You do see an element of, the travel moving into the next month, but you do see very short-term results by doing that. What that does to business operations and revenue and what have you, I guess that depends on your goals, and that sort of thing again has to come from the top. You can't put that in place without leadership approval.
Gotcha. Aaron asked around compensation goals tied to carbon reductions. Maybe I'll make a comment, and I'd love others to add here, which is, I think lots of people talk about compensation goals tied to carbon reduction. I think almost any type of compensation related programs, how you roll things out, how it's communicated, and how people are enabled to achieve them are really, really critical. As someone who spent the better part of the last 25 years running different sales teams, the worst thing that can happen is you set compensation tied goals where people don't feel empowered to hit them or understand how to do it. And it actually can be a negative. And so I do think ultimately, as Sally mentioned, we're going to live in a world where companies and many employees are going to have compensation linked goals related to carbon reduction. But the key is, once you choose to go down that path, you have to provide the teams and the individuals with the tools that they're used to manage towards those reductions, whether that's through the enablement, whether that's through classic technology, whether it's through others. And so more often than not, what I see is, I believe the most successful companies have compensation linked goals, and they're not just linked to carbon specific compensation, but they're tied to that top level KPIs and business objectives, as Sally mentioned. But then they're also providing the individuals and teams with the tools to manage to those goals like they do with anything else, and enabling them around it. And I think more often than not, you find that we underinvest in the enablement around it, and we just sort of say, hey, here's a goal, go solve for it, and it causes challenges. But the ones that do it really well are thinking about it like any other goal, which is they're investing in the tools, they're investing in the enablement to empower people to be successful. Any other thoughts or comments?
It has to, I guess, I think it'd be really effective, and especially for leadership because they call the shots. But if you are applying this to, you know, Tom has got to be able to do something within his job to influence those emissions. So applying it just globally out, you know, to people who are in accounting, which probably can't do anything about it, is probably not wise. So keep it targeted. We may see travel managers having this in the next 5 years because you do have the power to influence that. I don't know how you could apply to travellers, but one message that is quite effective for travellers is that travellers have the power and the influence on that particular carbon reduction. So they can't influence most of scope 1, 2, and most of 3, but they do have the power on these emissions. So maybe it's not like a compensation type goal, but if the messaging is that you're giving them the power, you own this goal, you know, that gets people to really think about, you know, their behavior and their travel choices.
Yeah, it's a really good call out. I think more often than not, the question of how far and where do you cascade compensation linked goals is a very important one, because leadership tends to really be the ones that can drive most of the decision making. The individual traveler has a much narrower set of choices that they can operate in. And so where you push down really matters a lot. I think it's a very good call out. Amélie, I'd love to ask this next one to you, which is, what's the best example of a carbon reduction initiative that almost always reduces cost as well?
Oh, I don't know if that's going to be a popular answer, but reducing travel, quite obviously, is one of the best levers of action because it reduces emissions and you reduce costs, quite obviously. But I know we're all in the travel industry because we love traveling, right? So the second best option that I've noticed with a lot of clients is looking at the business class usage. So this one, depending on your travel program, can be very easy or can be more tricky. You know, we have some set of clients that travel business a lot, even on short haul. So that's like an easy thing, right, to really target those types of routes, and where available, you know, shifting to premium economy, for instance, especially if it's a day flight. So that is one area where you will always reduce cost as well as emissions. Yeah, but again, the big one is really when you fly very far, like especially the very long long haul flights. Looking at those, understanding whether they make sense, maybe reducing the cadence and the frequency of those trips, that will obviously save you a lot of money and will get you to your goals.
Gotcha. Thank you. Scott asked a couple of questions around KPI and carbon intensity as sort of a top line metric. Sally, how have you thought about balancing what should be the single top line metric? Is it an intensity metric, like something like a carbon intensity per dollar per people, or is it an absolute? Kind of, do you have a perspective as to if you had to get to sort of that main one, what should it be?
Yeah, it's going to be different for everyone. I'm like, sorry, I'm bowing out of like the one that's the best. But if I could tie it into the question that Abby said below, she's saying that for smaller organisations, what approach and levers do you need for expected organisational growth? So you could have a startup that then goes into scale up mode, and that's where a carbon intensity metric is really powerful. And also, you can, when you're starting off as a small organisation, it's good to embed it there and then because it's easy, and then new people come in, it's just the norm. So looking at carbon per traveller is really effective because everybody can then own their emissions, especially if you do a comparison through engagement. Like Amélie said, this is what the average person in the world carbon emissions are. This is the average American, and if they've got traveling more quite frequently and it's more than the average American, you know, that's a really good metric to use. If you as a travel buyer, as the owner of the program, maybe emissions per dollar spent on travel. And then you can really track that maybe if you are spending more on a flight, but that is a lower carbon option, then you will see like a decreasing metric, and that's easy to track over month, then that's always a good one to do. But it depends who you're talking to. Everyone's going to have a different metric. The only metric that applies to everyone is absolute reductions, which, yeah, not everyone can work with.
Gotcha. Thank you. Well, a couple last ones as we close out. Abby asks, for smaller organizations, what approach or levers can be used to ensure the policies account for expected organizational growth? Maybe I'll take that as a small organization that's growing quite quickly and trying to manage it. I think the thing that we do, one is we use intensity-based metrics to account for that growth. And two, we really focus on the purpose and the value of our travel. So as we think about our planning, we think about what is the role that travel is going to play, what is the outcomes it's going to deliver. There are going to be new customer acquisition goals. There'll be maintaining and retaining our customers and customer value. And then there's a lot around team, and actually using that to map and plan allows us to be intentional about where do we want to allocate our finite resources, and then look and track and empower teams to manage to those goals. And what we find is leaders tend to have a really good sense of what's the role of travel and helping them achieve their objectives. And we found that to be really an important way to do it. Another question here from Abby, and we'll have one more after this, which is, do you have an example, and this probably maybe to Emily, of when organizations were resistant to implementing a sustainable travel policy? What approach do you utilize, if any, to ease tensions and build support?
Yeah, so that definitely happens, especially when that leadership buy-in is missing, and you have a travel team that is very excited to move forward with sustainability. So that is quite, it happens. We have example that we can definitely talk about in more detail, although in 1 minute I won't have too much time. But the approach I would say that is utilized is that it refers back to that engagement, right? So starting with what you have and communicating to your traveler, while also having those focus group with leadership to explain to them what you're trying to achieve, how you're planning on achieving this, and understanding what is a holdup on their side. So my answer is quite short, but Abby, if you want to reach out, we can have more of a discussion to see if that can help you. But I would say yes, engagement at all level is very, very important to move this forward.
Terrific.
And just don't call out, you're not going to please everyone. You're never going to please everyone.
That's
and
fair.
Sometimes, so it's just this thing and that kind of noise. If you get a noise from 10%, but 90% support it, then that's when you get your stick out and, start hitting the noisy ones. Not really, I'm not advocating violence anyway, but I don't think you're ever going to implement a policy where you do not get any pushback. So.
Well, with that, I'll say thank you, and we'll end. I know we missed some follow-up questions, so if you have any others, please do reach out, and we're happy to follow up. If you'd like more information, there's lots more resources that you can pull. There's just an endless set of resources and tools that this group has put together that we're happy to share. And with that, I'll say thank you to everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. Enjoy August and a happy and healthy rest of summer. Have a great one. Talk to everyone later.
Thank you.
Bye.